Good evening, at least good evening for Slovenes and for Irish people. I presented you, Keith, as one of the youngest and the brightest thinkers of the so-called dissident right, if I may say so. Thanks for accepting my invitation. I really wanted to talk to you for a while now because I consider you as one of the most consistent thinkers on the right, at least on the alternative right. I know Ireland mm, through three anecdotes, or at least through three different people. I remember when John Lennox. Do you know John Lennox? Um,
The theologian guy?
yeah, theologian, mathematician guy. Yeah, he was in Ljubljana, and he told a joke that he later on told many times that some of the people asked him, "Aren't you Irish, all madly religious, or something like that?" That was my first memory, and the second thing I remember Ireland for is talking to some of the libertarians or anarcho-capitalists through the years, telling me that Ireland is a big success and we should be more like Ireland because Ireland is a home of many big tech corporations, multinational um, giants, and so forth. And then I know Ireland through you, a young and bright third positionist thinker. How is it in Ireland right now? Are you considered well there, or are people calling you a fascist or extreme right wing, or how is it for you in Ireland?
Yeah, I get all that. I mean, I guess in terms of pushback, like the Antifa here probably isn't as developed as it is in some other European countries because Ireland's always like a bit behind some of the European trends. I think it's a bit like that, but they're definitely trying to make up for that now. Like there's a prominent Antifa guy. I mean, he's basically just a Twitter account, but he got like 175,000 euros in government funding. They basically set up an NGO to track the far right in Ireland, and the whole NGO was essentially his blog that published two articles, as far as I know. So that's the kind of thing that's going on now. There's all this like NGO money sloshing around. They're starting to turn their sights towards nationalists, distant right, whatever. And yeah, it's just that typical thing where you have like an abundance of liberal journalists and leftist radicals, and they kind of want to justify their own existence and kick up a scare. So I think it won't be long before we kind of catch up to the rest of Europe. I mean, they're passing through hate speech laws now, so that will be the next thing. And yeah, it's like, there's difference between countries in Western Europe, but it seems like they're all kind of converging on the same place.
I remember hearing from you in one of your streams that you came from the left, if I heard you right. So what's your story? What's your life story like? What was your progress or development in political philosophy?
Well, I was kind of an uneasy leftist, but I mean, like the dynamic is kind of different in Ireland because nationalism has always been more associated with the left. Like, what's called republicanism in Ireland, which is associated with Sinn Féin, has always had like a strong economic leftist bent. So that's kind of naturally where I went. Um, but yeah, I guess as I got more into looking at the ideas of political philosophy, I guess leftism and the kind of people that promoted leftism were just sort of instinctively off-putting to me. There didn't seem to be any kind of idealism there. It just seemed like a lot of resentment and just kind of gross like materialism, individualism. So I was always kind of looking for something more in that regard. I was more interested in philosophy, and I kind of came at it from a more intellectual angle. Like I got interested in like traditional conservative writers, and then kind of ended up sort of coming back to nationalism with that more sort of rounded perspective. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of an intellectual interest for me, but obviously there's always the kind of pressing interest in Europe of like demographic changes and some of the things that are more immediately visible. So, you know, at the same time you're reading about this stuff in books or whatever, you do have these realities that are very visible on the ground as well that kind of connects this stuff to our current situation.
Um, I listened to one of your podcasts where you talked about of whether the right, or at least dissident right, can in any way relate to the left, or make a sort of and I started thinking about it, and I see, for example, in Slovenia you have left wingers who would say they are also nationalists, but when you push them, there's always civic nationalism behind their nationalism. So how is it in Ireland with the left wing? Can in relationship to this, is it even possible to for the dissident right um to get to to consider to be in the same team with left wingers?
Yeah, I don't think it is, because I think sometimes people look at the left and they think, well, you know, they agree with us on maybe like some economic issues or whatever, so maybe we can find common ground with them just on those issues. But I think generally, you know, the leftist is more a personality type than anything in some ways, and generally I think it's at the point now where the kind of anti-white stuff is so embedded in leftism that most of them really put that stuff ahead of the economic stuff. You know, it's like when they celebrate big tech companies, you know, banning nationalists or whatever, they're completely on the side of big tech in those cases. So I already see an alliance in that regard, but I do think we can win people from the left. I mean, I think there's a lot of like misguided people on the left that have good intentions, at least, because the left attracts moral idealists. You know, it attracts people that are very interested in like systems and kind of understanding the world in a sort of abstract way. Like they tend to think very politically. You know, you find with sometimes with conservatives, they can sort of personalize everything, and they don't kind of have the you know, the sort of radical mindset. You get that a lot more on the left. A lot of them are just sort of resentful. There isn't really any kind of idealism there. But I do think the ones that have the right intentions, as the left becomes so sort of anti-human and abandons more of the economic positions that used to characterize it, I do think there'll be more people kind of alienated from the left that'll be looking for something that seems more authentic, more radical. So I think we can attract those people, but that doesn't mean I don't think we should ever like change our beliefs to try and like win over the left or anything. I don't think you can win them by appeasing them. You know, you have to kind of be unapologetic and, you know, make a case for your entire system. And I think if you do that, you won't get all of them, but you'll get the right people, I think.
Which term do you prefer? Are you a third positionist, or a right winger, or a true right winger, or a dissident right winger, or even alt right winger? Although I'd say you probably wouldn't prefer this last term.
Yeah, no, no one else. I don't think that's been in fashion for a while. um, I, I mean, I'm kind of fine with nationalists. I mean, I think that's kind of like the pressing issue in terms of demographic changes, what's going on in Europe. You know, what form nationalism has to take. I mean, people can get into the weeds and that to say that if you call yourself a nationalist, you have to like, you have to be some kind of a liberal, or you have to accept like a certain kind of nation state or all this. I think the term has kind of become more fluid. I think it encompasses a lot of people, and it's not one that's so kind of off-putting to people like some other terms. It doesn't have the same kind of baggage. I think it still resonates with people on a deep level. So yeah, I'm kind of happy to use that. I think third position is good as well, just for the tendency to sort of knock people out of that kind of binary thinking and look at things in a sort of more cohesive way than like blue team, red team. But yeah, I guess I'm happy with nationalists.
Would you say that nationalism started as a left wing ideology in the 19th century? And if it did, how would you propose to get rid of some sort of cognitive dissonance we nationalists nowadays have? At least I sense some sort of a cognitive dissonance when I am considering my ideology, and when I say I'm a nationalist, and when I'm considering the historical development in 19th century, and how nationalisms were used to ruin what we nationalists in this area in Slovenia, Western Balkans, and so forth, consider to be an optimal or even idealistic monarchy, Austro-Hungarian. When we think about Austro-Hungarian monarchy, we can see that nationalisms have been used against it. And then nowadays we call ourselves nationalists. In this sense, I think I'm thinking about cognitive dissonance. What would you propose how to solve this?
Yeah, there's no doubt you have a point, and this is like an argument that the radical traditionalist types will make a lot. That nationalism was actually something that was kind of destructive to like a truly traditionalist political order. That it was kind of the leftism of its day, as it was a rebellion against monarchy and took away some of the power of the church as well. And that's true in the in the current form of like geolinguistic nationalism, the sort of romantic nationalism. I mean, there's no doubt that it came to prominence in the way it did. It took the form it did because it did benefit the merchant class of the time. But I think people can kind of get too abstract when they look at that. Like what I'd say is, nationalism, like in its state form, might be kind of a recent phenomenon, and it may have been, it was the stick that the merchants used to beat the dog, right? But that doesn't mean that it's, that it's naturally their ideology or anything. It just happened to be useful at the time, the same way it was useful for, Stalin to appeal to nationalism when the panzers were coming into Russia. But I think when people talk about that it's this kind of modern phenomenon or something, I think they can kind of be playing a bit of a shell game where they confuse a lot of things. I mean, yes, people didn't have the same conception of nationalism, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. But I do think there were ethnic states. I think there was always some conception of an ethnos, even in Rome. Egypt was kind of an ethnic state. They had a conception of a distinct Egyptian people. I know it's say like if people don't like the word nationalism, you can use the word tribalism. I don't think anyone can argue that tribalism isn't something that's deeply primordial and well before liberalism and well before politics at all, in terms of something that's essential to the human condition. And I think like a certain that isn't really, it's not a left wing or a right thing at all, really. It's just a recognition of reality, a recognition that we have this tribal nature. We have, just genetic similarity theory that is a whole body of science built upon this idea that, people tend to have more empathy to form more cohesive societies with people more genetically similar to them. And I don't think there's anything liberal about acknowledging that or about integrating that into how you do politics. Whether you think there's some kind of absolute sort of religious or spiritual value in having an absolute monarchy or some kind of religious imperium, I mean, that's a different question. But how that would even be brought about now, or how sort of opposing ethnic self-determination for Europeans is going to help bring that about, I don't really know. And I guess that's a criticism I'd have of those types that make those kinds of criticisms of nationalism is nationalism seems to be the only thing that is advancing some kind of conception of order or virtuous government or natural law. And so, even if it is bound up with maybe some liberal conceptions today, well, again, I don't think that's anything necessarily inherent to it.
I think at least in this area, in Austro-Hungarian Empire and then in Yugoslavian Empire, it was nationalism was related to this idea that what is being crucial to a nation is language. This is what turned the conservative thinkers, the Slovene conservative or traditional thinkers of 19th century to become liberal thinkers, in the sense that they turned against the Austro-Hungarian Empire and they started thinking about how Slovenes should be with Croats and Serbs, for example, which was never an idea before, at least not in such a sense. And this is what after the First World War led to Yugoslavian Empire, and then after the Second World War to the second Yugoslavia, which was a communist one. And I saw your documentary, your film about ex-Yugoslavia and how it fell apart, and I considered it one of the best documentaries a foreigner did on Yugoslavia. Yet I still think that you might not have considered this problem with Yugoslavia. Slovenes, for example, never ever wanted to, at least the folk, to get in the same empire as Croats and Serbs. They were practically pushed into this empire, and then later on into the republic or communist country. So even, and I did I have to say, you probably got it all right, that it was America and so forth that tried and in the end ruined Yugoslavia. It had some merit. That's what I wanted to say. What would you say about it? Yeah, I'm sorry. Even a Serbian commentator says even Serbs didn't want Yugoslavia.
Yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, the Yugoslavia video I did wasn't meant to be kind of an authoritative, like, here's my complete understanding of Yugoslavia. It was mostly based off the Michael Parenti book, which I thought was quite good, and I wanted to turn it into video form because I thought there was like a good lesson kind of about how the US functions there and how it wields its power. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, should the Slovenes have their own state? I think absolutely. Yeah, I think I think the value of studying things like the Yugoslavia conflict is kind of just how the US has kind of used these conflicts for their own nefarious interests. You even see in the Ukraine, they were funding like the Azov battalion, like neo-Nazi groups in eastern Ukraine. So I think, from that sort of geopolitical angle, it's quite interesting. But in terms of like smaller states and like, you know, there's this idea that like smaller states is always a bad thing, and you need some kind of great super state like Yugoslavia for nations to have any kind of sovereignty. I think that was probably more true in the 80s or 90s, but I think it's becoming less and less true due to kind of developments in technology and changes in economics and political technology that's kind of going to allow more independence for smaller sort of tribal communities. I mean, you could look at like the example of Afghanistan, but I do think it's getting harder and harder for those great empires to wield power like they did in the past. But obviously, that's hard to predict.
No, I basically agree that there's no place for such small countries to have its own independence. It's de facto quasi independence. But Slovenes were um, they ideologically um, fucked us up with the idea of Euro-Atlanticism. For example, this is where we found a new hope when we turned away from Yugoslavia, for example, which tells us that Slovenes weren't so naive as to think they can do it alone. They can truly be independent. They threw themselves into the arms of NATO and EU. And nowadays you can see that Slovenes we're not happy with it, and we're already searching a new quasi or pseudo monarchy where we could find our place, for example, in Visegrad V4 and so forth. So yes, I agree. Such small countries don't cannot have any true independence. Um, but if this is true, to what extent is nationalism even possible?
Well, I think it's changing to a large extent actually in terms of I do think we're heading for a more multipolar world in terms of the US isn't quite able to exercise the same level of control over states. Um, I think by the end of this decade, the US will have declined a lot in terms of its power projection. It's still going to have the strongest military in the world, but culturally, economically, um, Russia, China, and even the EU will probably be more influential geopolitically. Uh, and I think you know all this stuff is kind of contingent on like political, economic, technology. And I think there's a lot of changes in that regard that's making it possible for smaller statelets to kind of occupy like silos of sovereignty. And you know, like the process of history, it's not always like inexorably heading towards centralization and empire. And I think we're kind of heading in the opposite direction now. So I do think, you know, there's a lot of trends that are not looking good in terms of mass society and the capacity for bureaucracies to kind of manage these great empires. But in terms of sort of neo-tribal communities, in terms of strong ethnic communities with a sense of, I think, like the Muslim or Arab term for it is like asabiya, like a strong sense of nationhood and community. I think that's becoming more of an advantage than ever. I mean, you see it with Afghanistan. You know, like the biggest empire doesn't always win. Sometimes a smaller state, if it has a strong sense of nationhood, of religious community, of ethnic kinship, actually can assert itself. I mean, would anyone say now that Afghanistan under the Taliban is just a pawn of China or Russia or America? I don't think so. Um, so I think, you know, the idea that small states are just the pawns of bigger powers, I think that was more true in the 20th century. I think the 21st century will be a bit different.
Um, Carlota Puig from Catalonia asks, is Keith in favor of small Ireland being an independent state, or should it merge with other nations, Great Britain, EU nations, into a more powerful, influential state?
Well, I don't think it's viable to have a merger. I mean, especially Ireland and Britain. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Not if the people have any say in it anyway. But I mean, is it necessary for these countries to merge? I mean, in terms of opposing immigration or something, I don't think it makes a huge difference. I mean, in terms of sort of countries to assert themselves kind of on a global stage, maybe so they can resist like the impositions of the United States' hegemony in terms of the influence that has on culture and economics and so on. Then yeah, I think you do need some kind of European integration. But in terms of that being a completely unified state, like without internal borders, I don't think you actually have to go that far. I think it's kind of a difficult balance to strike, and I think like the EU has kind of integrated too far in the wrong direction in some ways, and not enough in other ways. Like if they had a more um, if they had a more muscular central bank with something more like the Federal Reserve, it'd be much easier for them to overcome some of the economic shocks that we suffered, like in the last decade or so. Um, but they have this sort of very conservative approach to economics that's kind of dictated by Germany's influence. But then I think they're kind of too integrated in some other ways in terms of like the ridiculous laws and regulations, some of the stuff that had the Brexit voters up in arms, that just becomes very tedious and becomes this kind of Brussels bureaucracy. In terms of Ireland, I mean, I wouldn't be for Ireland leaving the EU at all, because it would just be economic suicide at the minute, and it wouldn't make a huge difference to anything. I mean, in terms of like immigration, that's something that's really the fault of the Irish government more than the EU, in terms of the kinds of immigrants that are coming here and how they're getting here. So I don't think, for nationalists in Europe, I don't think the most pressing issue is dissolving the EU or anything. But I also don't. I'm not, under the fantasy that the EU is anything other than an institution of neoliberalism and neoliberal technocrats, and I don't really see a time at present where it could be reformed into anything else.
When you did your research on Yugoslavia, what's your opinion on how, in which sense, and why do you think uh, Americans are using Kosovo Albanians as a now as a pawn state in ex-Yugoslavia, and as a pawn population, because they are a demographical and cultural problem in Macedonia. They are becoming a bigger problem in Slovenia, for example. Even our fake right wing government, or at least um, centrist government now, being led by a fake right wing party called SDS, with our Prime Minister Janez Janša is actually known by by really importing many Kosovo Albanians into Slovenia, while in the same time trying to impress us with the so-called civic nationalism. It's really funny. But what do you think? My why am I persuaded that Kosovo is a pawn state? They were supposed to be the majority Muslim state, yet they almost immediately mm, after Trump told them, they went um, to Israel, and then what is your opinion on this topic, please?
I've seen conflicting things on that. I've heard stuff about supposedly minerals in Albania that were valuable. I don't really think. I don't find that especially convincing. Was it that they wanted like a NATO stronghold in that area for strategic reasons? Possibly. I think the more likely thing is probably just that they wanted. It was always a British policy, the balance of power, and I think probably the US coming at the end of the Cold War had a similar way of looking at the map of Europe in terms of a balance of power and dismantling and isolating states that would potentially be hostile to their hegemony. So I think in that sense, they probably used Albania as a pawn somewhat. I mean, is it especially valuable to the globalist powers to have Albania? I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, they don't seem to be such a holdout of economic prosperity now or anything. So yeah, I'm open to that question. I've heard different things from people in the Balkans about what they think Albania or Kosovo specifically was valuable to NATO.
What's your take on Afghanistan, for example?
Well,
And
what's your position? What's your opinion on that, by the way?
On Afghanistan,
No, on Albania and Kosovo.
Oh, Albania and Kosovo. They are. It's probably because they wanted to mess with Serbia, and Serbia was, from the perspective of big countries as America always thought of as the hegemon in a monarchy of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. All those the Slovenes and Croats have been lied to, as in they'd be entering the more egalitarian monarchy as the Austro-Hungarian one, and they just entered another. They just grouped with another hegemons, which are Serbs, and this was the problem in Yugoslavia all the time. And at the end, this was the main public argument why we are leaving the Yugoslavia, because Serbs went too far with their hegemony. And yeah, Kosovo is considered by the Serbs as their sacred land, for example, and Serbian monarchy was probably considered as a proxy of Soviet or Russian Empire. I don't know. This is my opinion. But it's not really very well elaborated. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. That's my opinion as well. Like, I think sometimes when people look at like, why is the US getting involved here? I think they get a bit. A lot of times the resources explanations aren't very good. Like if they say they're going there for oil or for lithium or something, I found a lot of times when you look into that is kind of scant evidence, that America is, spending billions to supposedly get a few hundred million in exports of lithium or something. So, I mean, a lot of those kinds of explanations that are more like conspiracy oriented, I don't really buy. I think you're probably right that they probably thought that Serbia was getting a bit too big for its boots, and that with the end of the Cold War, they had this sort of outlier state that wasn't really playing ball with the way the West likes to do things. And I think they just saw Kosovo and Albania as kind of a battering ram that they could use against it.
Yeah, and they are majority Muslims, and yeah, Thunderstruck says rightfully so that Russia has traditionally had a protective stance towards Serbia, and the U.S. wanted to humiliate them. This is probably the least of it all. But I'm not sure. This is my stance on it for now. for example. And and Slovenes have been and Croats have been fooled into NATO and into EU as new monarchies, better monarchies, more
Yeah, it
Western
was a shame.
monarchies.
It was a shame that didn't that happen last year when the Serbian president signed a bill to recognize Israel, and he didn't seem to know what he was signing. There was quite a famous clip that went around where um,
Uh,
he signed this bill
I,
next to Trump, and then it was like he was reading it, and it seemed like it was the first time he realized what was in there.
yeah, I saw that clip. He was together with Trump and the Kosovo president or something. I'm not sure who Kosovo president is. I have to admit I'm a little bit negatively biased towards them. Um, yeah, uh, uh, how do you consider Visegrad or V4 with their so-called right-wing populism and their leaders as Orban? Are they? Is there any legitimacy to them, or are they uh, puppets or pawns to the cathedral, to say it in Mollbox terms? Um, what's your opinion on it?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about the internal politics of these countries. I mean, I like everyone. I kind of I'll see articles about Hungary or Poland or Czechia or these countries now and then, but I wouldn't be usually familiar with the internal politics or anything. Uh, I mean, I think a lot of stuff that I've seen coming out of those countries is a positive. Um, People can be a bit purist, like in the national scene sometimes, where they'll say, "Well, this country like is very pro-Israel or something." I think obviously political parties are extremely constrained in what they can do. Um, I mean, the main thing is, with how bad the demographic crisis is now, mass immigration, just the prevalence of like Americanized liberalism, whatever you want to call it, global homo. I think if you can kind of survive intact without having a massive migrant population, and you can just kind of, I think we're going through the worst of it now, in terms of this order. I think we may be in the last decade or two of it. So, like our Hungary or Czechia or some of these countries, like the perfect kind of government, I imagine, no. But I mean, if they're preserving their people and they're sticking up against the EU and maintaining a strong border policy, and in the case of Hungary, encouraging birth rates through financial incentives and so on, I mean, I think that's a positive. And I'm not really going to get hung up on, some of the internal flaws of these parties or ways that they're not pure enough. I'm just kind of happy to see that there's somewhere in Europe where this stuff is being normalized, because it does seem like as well that it translates down to people's attitudes, and that you talk to people from Poland or Hungary, and they're actually quite proud of this. They're quite proud that they're not following the trend of Western Europe. So I think that's a good thing, and I'll continue to hope for the best from those countries and hope that they continue those kinds of policies.
Is Israel, in your opinion, really so powerful that it's essential to small countries to pander to them as they do, for example, Slovenia panders to Israel immensely, and this is getting embarrassing even lately. And even when I listened to Viktor Orban's interview with Tucker Carlson, I he started talking to about his opponents in Hungary as anti-Semites, and
I heard about that actually. Yeah. I never saw the interview, but I heard that they had a bit where they were talking about anti-Semitism or something.
yeah, I mean, yeah, and this struck me as I don't want to be a purist or right wing purist or something like that, because we are our numbers are not ideal. Even so, but we have to be careful about false prophets, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's usually a sign in nationalist politics when a party comes along and suddenly they have the Israeli flags out and they're expressing opposition to Islam, not because of the immigration aspects of it so much, but because of Islam isn't liberal enough, or the Muslims are going to be cruel to European Jews, and they kind of use the anti-Semitism argument. Any of the kind of controlled opposition, people like Tommy Robinson, you see this with them, where Tommy Robinson now, who started out as this advocate for British people against, he was talking about grooming gangs quite early on, and a lot of these different things. Now, like, anytime I see anything from Tommy Robinson, it's he's going around with an Israeli flag, and he's talking about the barbarity of Palestinians. And it's kind of, I mean, there's people like this in almost every European country, as far as I can see, that show up as the new acceptable faces of nationalism, and they've got their country's flag in one hand and they've got the Israeli flag in another. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a bad sign. Although I think that's kind of changed in the last few years. I think people are tolerating that a lot less, and they're looking at that with more suspicion now. But in terms of, I mean, I'd maybe give a bit more leeway to, these ruling parties, and that I think, if you're in power, you kind of have to toe certain lines, just to not completely get the ire of the international community. I mean, it bothers me as much as anyone, but again, is there much that a small country in Europe can even do about that issue at the moment? Right now, not really. But yeah, definitely, like you said, I think the idea that Zionism and nationalism, European nationalism, are bedfellows is a a bad idea that could do with being sort of purged from national circles.
Do we have, in your opinion, any chance to stop that, or to even make it as public as possible for as many people as possible to recognize this?
Well, I think it's getting a lot better. I mean, they've done polls, and support for Israel among Republicans in America has actually gone down a lot in the last few years. They're probably the most supportive political group in the world in terms of like a group of conservatives, American conservatives, and their support for Israel is really something. But I think it's gone down like 10% in the last few years, and among young people, they're becoming kind of ambivalent about Israel. So that issue that really like dominates older conservatives' minds, there's all the memes about American conservatives, sending their kids to die for Israel, like that's a great honor or something. That doesn't seem to really exist among the younger generation, and it's kind of becoming normal to criticize Israel in ways it wasn't a few years ago now. Maybe social media contributed to it a lot. But I saw it with the last bombing they did of Gaza. You go on social media or anything, and obviously leftists are really anti-Israel from the perspective of being pro-Palestine and this kind of anti-colonial position. But increasingly, you see less and less right-wingers are really willing to go out on a limb to defend Israel, because they know they're going to get pushback from the more radical nationalist types. They know it's going to make them look a bit, grifter, like who's he working for? And then the people that are supporting that used to be super pro-Israel are kind of more ambivalent now, because it's more normal to say, like Trump kind of contributed to this, where it's more normal for an American right-winger to say, like, well, why should I care about what's going on in the Middle East? Why should I care about this country? Look at our own problems here. So I do think there's been kind of a change in terms of this small state in the Middle East dominating people's minds so much. I think it's just kind of reverting now to people being more ambivalent about it.
Although it's still very normal for mainstream conservatives in America to be willing to debate the communists, for example, and not the nationalists. Nick Fuentes, who was the champion of this America First rhetoric, or he still has many problems. He was kicked out of YouTube, I think, and so forth. And even in Slovenia, I had so many problems with with Israel and the Holocaust without even ever publicly denying the Holocaust. I am well known in Slovene media as a Holocaust denier because a journalist, for Slovene journalist, probably of Jewish ethnicity. I asked what is the best evidence for Holocaust to have happened. We need to have the best evidence in order to be able to present this evidence to skeptics, and then we can all say, listen up, this is the best evidence. If you don't believe this, then I cannot help you. And he pasted the photography of a Cyclone B barrel in some sort of place, and I said to him, "This is epistemologically very low." And yeah, he wrote to all the Israel embassies in the area, in Vienna, Ljubljana, Zagreb, or wherever. And now I'm well known as a Holocaust denier in Slovenia, for example. And I lost my job in the mainstream right-wing media, and the bank closed my account and so forth. It's quite powerful, although it's, I don't know, that's why I asked you, how powerful do you think Israel really is? Or do you think it's all about money, or is it about Christian Zionism?
Oh, it's definitely not Christian Zionism. That's the main thing directed. I mean, yeah, the power of Israel is, that's one of the main sort of red pills people should get when they come over to our side, for sure, because, like you said, the constant deference from conservatives. I think American foreign policy has hugely been directed by the interests of Israel more than the interests of the United States at times. And yeah, I mean, there's political student groups in Ireland that were being infiltrated by Israeli organizations. So it's not like they just stick to American politics either. They're very influential in trying to sort of quell anti-Israeli sentiment or European nationalism in Europe as well. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, like, for the size of Israel and for the population, they have more influence than any country, kind of in that per capita way. And yeah, the power they wield over sort of public opinion making is incredible.
What do you think? It's so hidden. But for example, I would be pleased if I would get some information on the question of whether there's any sovereignty or any independence for my country and for my people, for my nation possible. And if they say no, it's not possible, yours are slaves or something, I say okay. And if they showed me some evidence why we couldn't have that, why do you think it's so hidden? Would it be that there would be many revolts or revolutions if people would be told something like that?
Oh yeah, look, I mean, it doesn't. It's. I don't think it would sit well with the American people if they thought that the foreign wars where, you know, their children were going to die was being done for this, you know, for the interests of a small nation on the Mediterranean. Although, well, maybe with some of the Republican voters, actually, they'd be all for it if they just came out and said it. But yeah, it has to be hidden. I mean, there's quite strong anti-Israel sentiment in Europe, really. I saw a poll about this last year, even before the latest Gaza thing kicked off. And in every country in Europe, people are massively on the side of, like, the Palestinians in that dispute. Most people think that the behavior of Israel is really heinous, more than any state. So I think they're quite aware, like, public opinion is against them. So generally they have to sort of take the, you know, so shall we say, Israeli representatives in Europe have to keep some bit of distance in terms of not acting like they're acting, you know, sort of Israel first. Because obviously that would mean people would treat them with a lot more suspicion. But yeah, I mean, you know, people that are that powerful, it's in their interest to hide that as much as possible, and have people direct their ire at other kinds of shibboleths.
Mm. Why do you think many leftists or left wingers would be on point, according to the Israel and Israel lobby in America, and they would often talk about capital or grand capital, or but they just don't seem to be able to connect all the dots. What do you think is the biggest problem of the left? Because the left, as you already said, as we is against Israel, is pro-Palestine, is against this big tech, seemingly, at least prima facie, at least against these big corporations, against big capital. Why do you think? Are they fake, or are they just not being able to connect all the dots?
I think a big part of it is fear. I think that's the same thing with the right. I mean, I've often talked to people about this. And, you know, generally the line for the left is they're anti-Israel, but they say that Israel is kind of a pawn of the American empire, that the US kind of uses it as its foothold in the Middle East. So they'll criticize it from that kind of anti-American position. But, you know, in terms of presenting the other idea back to them, like, well, maybe if these countries are so interlinked, you know, maybe that Israel has a certain control over the United States as well. It'd certainly be in their interest. You know, if they are just so reliant on the US to exist, as you say, and they're their pawn, well, you know, wouldn't it make a certain amount of sense that Zionists then would work to gain more control over American foreign policy? In terms of the responses I get back, I mean, I just think it's mostly fear and social status, because very rarely will they have some kind of solid argument for why that's not possible, or for why they don't think that's happening. Generally, they'll have very kind of convoluted, sort of intellectual answers where they'll deconstruct. You know, suddenly they start deconstructing everything. I think some people call this tactical nihilism, where as soon as you start disagreeing with someone on something like this, they'll get nihilistic about everything. You know, groups don't exist. People don't have interests. People don't conspire. Lobby groups don't influence government. All this, and you find this when you talk about this issue. Sometimes people become very irrational and make very bad arguments. And at a certain point, you realize it's not really about the argument. Probably a lot of them know, or if they don't know, they just don't want to go down that direction. And I think that's just largely, basically, you know, no one wants to be that guy, you know, especially if you're on the left. No one wants to be the ignoramus that doesn't understand that it's all imperial machinations, it's all capital colonialism, it's all historical structures of oppression. No one wants to be the guy that gives what sounds like, oh, you know, the dummies answer that, well, maybe this group is influencing this policy here. So I think it's largely fear, it's largely social status, it's largely just being a conformist. people don't want certain beliefs that are going to get them called mean names and going to get them ostracized. And I think you don't really need more of an explanation than that with most people, to be honest. There's the people that will really just like look for an answer and just accept the answer, whatever kind of social capital they lose, are extremely, extremely rare.
When mainstream right in Slovenia tries to impress the right wingers, it uses the term. It says something about bad Muslims and so forth. And the other thing is to use the term cultural Marxism. How big of an influence do you think cultural Marxism has had on all the biggest problems we nationalists see and want to get rid of? And how big do you think capitalism is of an influence? Which one is bigger?
Well, it's sometimes it's kind of a blurry distinction because obviously a lot of the ideas that are so destructive in the West now are from this kind of neo-Marxist school of thought, Western Marxism, which was kind of a break with the Marxist tradition in a lot of ways after the Second World War, where they started focusing on Marxist humanism, the early Marx. So they said, like, actually, we can kind of take out the economic determinism, and we can realize that actually what really matters in Marxism is this idea of alienation, and that culture and ideas can influence economic relations more. Marx was very much an economic determinist. It was all about economics, and culture was just downstream from economics. You couldn't influence economic change in a meaningful way through culture. So Western Marxists kind of flipped that on its head and said that you could make change primarily through control of culture, cultural deconstruction, and so on. In terms of is it capitalism? Is it Marxism? I think they were kind of useful bedfellows, and that I did a video about this, the talking about the Nazbol vortex, but going over the whole history of how basically like the US Western financial capitalists, the CIA, realized that then these kinds of ideas like the Marxist humanism, the New Left stuff, the stuff that was focused on, instead of economics, focused on psychoanalysis, LGBT, women's liberation, this stuff, they realized that their big enemy was the Soviet Union, and that if they could have the left in Europe become more socially focused rather than economically, that would make the left less of a threat to them. And so they started promoting all this stuff. The CIA heavily promoted feminists. They promoted the work of Herbert Marcuse. A lot of the big institutions like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation began to promote these ideas that were supposedly anti-capitalist, but they were primarily anti-capitalist in this sort of cultural, again, psychoanalytic perspective. So it's cultural Marxism, but at the end of the day, it's cultural Marxism that was propped up and that was used by capitalism to kind of make people accept liberalism. So it's kind of interesting the way those things clash in that way, because again, people can think in terms of like binaries of right wing versus left wing, capitalism versus communism, but really you see it's ultimately the same end. It's Western Atlanticist, mostly American financial elites that want control through liberalism, cultural liberalism, through dissolving traditions, religion, nationalism. And they'll use liberal ideas to do that. They'll use Marxist ideas to do that. They'll use whatever. And, cultural Marxism is something, psychoanalysis, deconstruction, critical theory, critical race theory, all this kind of academic deconstruction of normality and of sort of healthy traditions and things that people had that helped them to kind of resist liberalism and materialism, those ideas have proved to be quite useful in destroying that stuff. And every year, the universities produce more of these culture warriors that go and wage war basically on behalf of Fortune 500 companies and the U.S. State Department. So it's crazy to think about it in some ways, but yeah, the strange marriage between cultural leftism and the richest people in the world, but it's worked out quite well for them.
Yep. There's an interesting thing about Yugoslavia, for example, which was supposedly communist and so forth, and communists were supposedly against. They were not only supposedly against the church and against nationalism. For example, in Yugoslavia, they tried to construct or they tried to create a Yugoslav nation by mixing the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes with each other, for example. Yet, an interesting thing is that in '91, when Slovenia got independent, Slovenes in Slovenia were at the 90% perhaps, and the churches in '90s. In the beginning of the '90s were still full, and after 20 years of capitalism, sort of say, we are not allowed anymore to measure ourselves according to our ethnicity and religion, because it's obvious to so many Slovenes that there are not even 50% of Slovenes anymore in Slovenia. So what capitalism and independence brought to us, ironically, is that we are facing towards our extinction. And communism, who was supposed to make this instead of capitalism, stopped it for 50 years at least. This is really interesting and probably relevant to what we discussed right now.
Yeah, Jonathan Bowden mentioned that in one of his speeches. This kind of seeming paradox that the most leftist countries, the communist countries, that, as he says, I think he said they kind of like froze time, like for 60 or 70 years. They just froze it in its state. And so, you get to the 90s and the West is already so far down the path of liberalism, with mass migration and all that comes with it. And, you have these countries kind of still frozen in this sort of older form that, their governments never had the same incentive to adopt liberalism, because normally liberalism goes hand in hand with economic liberalism and capitalism. But yeah, I mean, I think that's just one of the sort of funny coincidences, or not coincidences, but one of the funny effects of sort of the geopolitical realities at the time. I don't think I think it's strange. Sometimes you get people that kind of defend communism from that perspective, but I don't think there's anything inherent to communism either that meant that it was going to be nationalistic. I think it was just the leaders being kind of pragmatic and having a different economic model. But yeah, who knows? I mean, maybe in the long run, it's a strange kind of blessing if your populations aren't going to be so demographically transformed as the Western countries are. I mean, certainly at present, the Eastern countries are looking in a lot better shape. Again, that's not thanks to communism or anything. It's just kind of a funny way that history played out in that sense.
The mainstream right, the global mainstream right, obviously getting directions and pseudo information from America, has been. It embraced this idea that true conservatism or right-wingism is basically libertarianism, and out of that ideology comes this idea that capitalism is basically just free markets. You don't believe that, do you?
No.
What is your main problem with this definition of capitalism that comes out of the libertarian, um, that comes from libertarians, that capitalism is basically just free markets, and that's all. That's why they've been promoting privatization without any reflection and so forth.
Oh, well, I mean, markets have always been around. What's different about capitalism is the rule of capital. That's what capitalism is, where you have this large investor class that needs somewhere to send its investment, and they begin investing for planned growth in the future, which kind of creates this inexorable process of growth and economic development. In terms of libertarians that advocate for privatization, I mean, this really became popular in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, and it hasn't really done anything to make people more free, as far as I can tell. I mean, it's the sort of reforms of neoliberalism that were kind of inspired by, or certainly justified with, libertarian thinkers like Milton Friedman and these people. It's expanded the state just in terms of its size. It hasn't made working middle class people any wealthier. All it's really done is transfer a lot of people to transfer a lot of wealth to the super rich. And yeah, I don't think those are good or pro-social policies to be advocating right now, especially because so many libertarian policies also involves things that weaken the state and are kind of detrimental to culture and to functioning nation. So yeah, I think it's very mistaken for right wingers to go down the libertarian path.
How can are they? What do you think? Are they naive, or because many times I hear from them, they are either nihilists. For example, they don't care about values. They don't care about whether the nation lives or does not, or they say they have these values. They just don't want to use state for the um, for their values, and this is basically, in my opinion, where they don't understand fascism, for example. Uh, Many right wingers, at least mainstream right wingers in Slovenia, would call themselves Democrats, and they would all the time they would say, "Oh, the communists have been ruling us for 60 years now. The communists have all the judges. The communists have all the capital and so forth. Yet they are not." Mm, willing to do anything about it or to use state about it. And fascism, okay, this is an oversimplification, of course, but fascism in the sense is right wingism that is prepared to use the state against the communism, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it gets very frustrating talking to libertarians because their answer to everything is less state and more markets, and they just there's no issue you can present them that will change their mind on that. They have one premise, which is that the state is bad, and it's going to be a loser's ideology because someone is going to take a state and beat you over the head with it and make you behave and do things they want you to do and make things they don't like illegal. And you can kind of either play on that terrain and you can try and build virtuous government and shape the world the way you want it to be, or you can you can not play it. But I mean, saying that the state is just bad and you want to get rid of the state, well, that's fine, but it's never going to happen. So, what are you gonna what are you gonna do in the present? Do you want to make the world fit your ideal more, or are you just going to drop out? Because I mean, if you advocate abolishing the state, you're essentially just dropping out. Maybe you're given kind of some legitimacy to like a more conservative party that wants to do some sort of privatization reforms, but really you're not really advocating anything serious. So yeah, I mean you're not really putting anything forward politically at that stage.
Two more questions. I don't want to push you too much because you had your stream today. China, would you say it's a communist, a socialist, or a fascist country?
Yeah, I think I think China is a national socialist, or yeah, you could use the word fascist. You could argue fascism kind of had its time and place, but it's a third position model of government. It's not. I don't believe it's ruling itself by the ideology of Marx. It's not going to Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto to learn what kind of reforms to do, but there is a guiding ideology, and the guiding ideology is what's in the interests of the Chinese people. It is a socialist state, but it's a kind of corporatist socialism. It's very much centrally directed, but they have markets. They have private ownership now. They're producing more billionaires than any country in the world. I think they tried the communist experiment. They tried having a totally centrally planned economy, and they realized what everyone else that tries to put Marx's theories into practice realizes, is that you can't really build a state on this, and Marx and Engels didn't really leave any proper guidance for how to run a state. And I think they were forced by the realities of government to find something that worked, that benefited their people. I don't think they're interested in a global proletarian revolution, a classless, stateless society. I don't think there's probably no Chinese politician that has any desire to eventually do away with the state or something. So I think they've gradually embraced nationalism and nationalist socialism, and I think that's why they're succeeding so well. They've the lowest foreign-born population of any country in the world. They're not kind of tainted by liberalism. They've done a lot of reforms recently where they were banning what they called like sissy men off the television, and they're doing things to weaken celebrity culture. They've put restrictions on children playing video games. So yeah, like someone mentioned there, Dengism and the reforms Deng made. He was very much not a super ideological person, but they took inspiration from earlier nationalist groups in China, like Sun Yat-sen. And I think they've gradually, they'll still call themselves communists, of course, because that's a legitimacy thing, because they have to say that they have a proper lineage with Mao for their own legitimacy. They can't just come out and say, well, we're not communists anymore, and we have nothing to do with Mao. We disavow Mao. We all those killings and all that revolution was kind of pointless, but we're in power now, so you have to accept it. So they still, of course, use the aesthetics and the trappings of Marxism, but in a practical sense, for all intents and purposes, it's a functioning nationalist country.
So people don't say we don't take critics, even if they're cultured. What do you think? I'm not sure I understand this comment fully, but do you, Keith? Everything Keith just said about libertarians applies to the dissident right as well. You're not going to infiltrate the system.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what that's in response to. What specific comment about libertarianism that was in response to?
Not sure. I hope he gets back to us, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure
that's
what.
that's the true comment about the communism being about internationalism. I said that
Yeah,
in the stream I did today, that Stalin has these writings where he's saying that socialism in one country is only ever meant to be temporary, and that in the fullness of time, national barriers and language will dissolve into kind of a world state. So yeah, communists will sometimes try and cope about that and pretend that they're sort of that they're not opposed to nationalism, but it's far from the truth. But yeah, you see with China, they clearly don't subscribe to that so much. I mean, Chinese scientists can openly talk about race differences and racial studies, and they're interested in sort of finding anthropology that supports Chinese people having originated in China. I think they're kind of rejecting the out of Africa theory of China, and race is something that seems to be discussed more openly there. And I don't think they have any fantasies about a global stateless society or dissolving the Chinese state or anything like that.
Yeah, and Yugoslavia was probably also a national socialistic country with a nation in the making. Probably they wanted to make a new nation, but afterwards they would be a fully national socialistic country with no borders open to Muslims from abroad and so forth. And even in the negative sense, most Yugoslavians were known to be really haters towards Kosovo Albanians, for example. Nobody liked Kosovo Albanians in Yugoslavia, and that was a um, common enemy. And it showed later on that it really was a common imperialistic enemy. Um, Let me see what was the next. Oh, this is what I wanted to ask you. My last question about your. I haven't been able to watch your debate with Joel and the Marxist dudes yet because I fell asleep yesterday and I didn't watch your analysis of it. Would you be so kind to in a couple of points to tell us what was the debate all about and why people here are saying that you really obliterated them?
Yeah, it's on my channel if anyone wants to watch it. It started out with we were arguing with one of them on Twitter who said it's ridiculous to make that argument that China isn't communist. And his argument is basically just that, they call themselves communists. That's kind of enough. And then he also started saying that 20th century fascist movements were like controlled by the British, or that they were controlled by international capitalists, all this kind of stuff, which I thought were all kind of ridiculous claims. So yeah, we had it out in the kill stream with Infrared and this guy Logo Daedalus. And yeah, I think it was, I mean, people can make up their own mind. I think it was a pretty comprehensive win. They gave us, I think it showed a lot of the problems with Marxism, and that, they were 5 minutes trying to give us a definition of socialism. They said, even though China isn't doing class struggle anymore, that it is, because we don't properly understand class struggle because it can be done through class collaboration. So then we kind of said, well, why doesn't that apply to fascism? And then they tried to say that fascism was kind of a creation of capitalists, and they didn't really have anything to back that up, and the history was very much on our side. And then, I mean, the funny thing was it ended with them sort of arguing against nationalism and arguing against the idea that people should be allowed to kind of live amongst themselves. And, these people that were presenting themselves as kind of the heroes of the working man, of the working class, were given these big intellectual deconstructions of what I think are very healthy, normal instincts. So I think it looked pretty bad for them, and I think we won on all the substantive points, really. And I think it just shows again like how kind of useless Marxism is for benefiting working people in any way, really, when you're getting into these intellectual deconstructions of all the things that actual working people actually care about.
this is probably also the main problem with left-wing academics, professors on universities. Would you say so?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's the same. I said this in a stream I did today. It's I had to take it down, but I'll re-upload it tomorrow. But yeah, I said this like like Marxism. You really see when you have those discussions where everything turns into a 5-minute diatribe about Hegel and Marx. That it's an ideology for academics to sit around arguing the finer points over all day, and for Twitch streamers and people that are like political addicts and really into political ideology to do 5 or 6 hour Twitch streams about arguing about. But that's why it's appealing to them. They can kind of deconstruct normal instincts. They can deconstruct people outside of their intellectual clique. But in terms of anything that kind of working people can relate to, again, I think it just shows you how lacking it is. It's a kind of an intellectual plaything for a certain kind of person.
Imagine I'm an analytical philosopher by my education, formal education, and imagine having a professor of political philosophy and ethics and so forth who says things like, "I don't understand Hegel. I don't, I don't understand Heidegger. This is too much for me. This is this is not understandable to me." Yet he would go on and teach political philosophy and ethics, and be a radical left winger with all these similar intuitions, as if he'd understand Hegel and so forth. Yeah, this is my experience with from the university.
That is quite something. I guess it doesn't shock me.
Yeah. Quittest Veritas, I actually quite like that NAS guy, even though he was wrong in some areas. That other guy logo looked like a total degenerate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it went. It was basically a 2-on-1. One of them was just kind of a guy that gives Twitter hot takes, but it didn't really translate into a debate where he actually had to defend them. So.
Okay, Keith, I took so much time from you. Thank you again for coming to my podcast. It's been a pleasure and it's been an honor. Thank you. Thanks to all the commentators, to all the viewers. I hope I can invite you some other time too. I know you're busy, but to all my audience, if you didn't know Keith Woods till now, please go to his channel. His channel is really, at least in my opinion, it's great. Thank you, Keith, and thanks to all the audience. Good evening and good night.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it.